On the morning of June 14, 2015, the bustling city of Charlotte, North Carolina, woke up to the shocking news of a brutal murder that shattered the tranquility of an upscale suburban neighborhood. What appeared to be the perfect life of a successful professional and devoted wife was about to unravel, revealing secrets of infidelity, lies, and deadly obsession. Stephanie Carter, a 37-year-old marketing executive, had everything she ever wanted, or so it seemed. She was married to Daniel Carter, a respected financial advisor, and they lived in a beautiful home in one of Charlotte's most affluent communities. To outsiders, Stephanie's life looked picture perfect: a successful career, a loving husband, and a luxurious lifestyle. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence lay deep cracks. Daniel was often away on business trips, working tirelessly to maintain their lavish lifestyle. His long hours and frequent absences left Stephanie feeling increasingly lonely and disconnected. Their marriage, once filled with love and passion, had slowly deteriorated into a series of polite but empty conversations about schedules, finances, and appearances. Stephanie's loneliness became more pronounced at work, where she often found solace in her professional achievements. But it was her boss, Richard Alden, a charismatic 45-year-old CEO of the marketing firm, who truly captured her attention. Richard was everything Daniel was not: charming, attentive, and always there with a listening ear. He made Stephanie feel seen, valued, and desired. Their relationship started innocently, with late nights working on projects and sharing drinks after long meetings, but the more time they spent together, the more their connection grew. Richard, a notorious womanizer with a reputation for pushing boundaries, began flirting openly with Stephanie, who initially dismissed his advances as harmless. However, as weeks turned into months, their professional relationship crossed into dangerous territory. By early 2015, Stephanie and Richard had begun an affair, filled with the excitement of stolen moments and the thrill of secrecy. They met in hotels, at Richard's apartment, and even in Stephanie's car, always careful to keep their relationship hidden from their spouses and colleagues. For Stephanie, the affair was an escape from her emotionally distant marriage, a way to feel alive again. But as their relationship deepened, so did the risks. Richard's possessiveness grew, and he began demanding more of Stephanie's time, even showing up unannounced at her home when Daniel was away. Stephanie, torn between the thrill of the affair and the fear of being caught, found herself trapped in a dangerous game of deception. The affair reached its boiling point on the night of June 13, 2015, when Stephanie told Richard she wanted to end things. She was overwhelmed by guilt and terrified of losing her husband if the affair were ever exposed. Richard, however, refused to let go. He became aggressive, accusing Stephanie of using him and threatening to reveal everything if she didn't continue the relationship. Stephanie left Richard's apartment that night, shaken and determined to regain control of her life. But her resolve would be tested in the most horrific way possible. The following morning, Stephanie's body was discovered by her husband, Daniel, lying lifeless on the floor of their kitchen. She had been brutally beaten, her face unrecognizable from the multiple blows, and the scene was a gruesome testament to a crime of passion. Daniel, distraught and unable to process the horror before him, immediately called 911. The police arrived at the Carter residence within minutes, and Detective Lisa Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. The crime scene told a chilling story. There were signs of a struggle, but nothing appeared stolen. It was clear that whoever had killed Stephanie had done so out of rage. Neighbors reported hearing shouting from the house late the previous night, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave. As Detective Monroe began her initial interviews, she quickly realized that Stephanie's seemingly perfect life was a facade hiding deep personal turmoil. The investigation was about to uncover a tangled web of lies, infidelity, and a deadly obsession that would change the lives of everyone involved. Detective Lisa Monroe knew from her years on the force that the most obvious answer wasn't always the right one. From the moment she stepped into the Carter residence, she sensed that Stephanie's murder was personal. The brutality of the attack indicated that the killer was driven by intense emotions: anger, jealousy, or both. Monroe's first task was to speak with Daniel Carter. He was visibly shaken, his face pale as he struggled to hold back tears. His grief appeared genuine, but Monroe couldn't rule him out just yet. She asked him about his whereabouts the previous night, and Daniel explained that he had been at a business dinner until late, arriving home around midnight. His alibi was corroborated by several colleagues, but Monroe still needed to dig deeper. Next, Detective Monroe turned her attention to Stephanie's workplace. The firm's employees were shocked by the news of Stephanie's death, but one name kept coming up in conversations: Richard Alden. Monroe learned that Richard was Stephanie's boss and that their working relationship had been unusually close in recent months. Several employees hinted at rumors of an affair, but claimed they had never seen anything concrete. Monroe decided to bring Richard in for questioning. He arrived at the station dressed sharply, maintaining an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. When asked about his relationship with Stephanie, Richard was evasive at first, dismissing their connection as purely professional. But Monroe's direct approach soon rattled him. She confronted him with the rumors, and Richard's demeanor shifted. Richard finally admitted to the affair, but insisted that it was Stephanie who had pursued him. He claimed she was unhappy in her marriage and had used him as an escape. He described their relationship as passionate but volatile, filled with intense arguments and frequent breakups. Richard downplayed his involvement, insisting that he had been at his apartment all night and had not seen Stephanie since their argument the previous evening. Monroe wasn't convinced. Richard's alibi was flimsy. He lived alone, and no one could verify his whereabouts at the time of the murder. She pressed him on the details of their last encounter, but Richard refused to provide specifics, growing defensive and hostile. Monroe's instincts told her there was more to the story, but without hard evidence, she couldn't detain him. As Monroe continued to piece together Stephanie's final hours, she uncovered a crucial lead. Security footage from a convenience store near Stephanie's home showed Richard's car driving through the neighborhood late on the night of the murder. The footage didn't place him directly at the scene, but it was enough to contradict his earlier statement about being at home. Monroe knew she had caught Richard in a lie, but it wasn't enough to prove murder. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined the crime scene and discovered traces of Richard's cologne on Stephanie's clothing, suggesting they had been in close contact shortly before her death. Additionally, a partially wiped down wine glass with Richard's fingerprints was found in the kitchen, further implicating him. The evidence pointed to Richard being at the Carter residence, but without direct proof of his involvement in the actual attack, the case remained circumstantial. Determined to break Richard's alibi, Monroe dug deeper into his personal life. She learned that Richard had a history of volatile relationships and had been accused of aggressive behavior by previous partners, though none of these incidents had resulted in formal charges. This new information painted Richard as a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and when things didn't go his way, he could become dangerous. On June 20th, 2015, Monroe brought Richard back in for questioning, armed with the new evidence. This time, her approach was more direct. She laid out the timeline, the footage, and the forensic findings, confronting Richard with the inconsistencies in his story. Richard's calm facade began to crack under the pressure, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You're lying," Monroe said bluntly. "We know you were there, we know you fought, and we know that you couldn't handle her walking away." Richard's reaction was immediate. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising as he tried to defend himself. He admitted that he had gone to Stephanie's house that night, but he swore he hadn't killed her. According to Richard, their argument had escalated, and Stephanie had ordered him to leave. He claimed that he had stormed out in anger, leaving her alive and well. Monroe listened carefully, but Richard's story didn't add up. The timeline was too convenient, and his demeanor suggested he was hiding something. Monroe decided to hold Richard overnight while they continued to build their case, hoping that the mounting pressure would push him to confess. The pressure on Richard Alden was mounting. Detective Monroe and her team continued to probe every aspect of his life, hoping to find the missing piece that would directly link him to Stephanie's murder. As the investigation intensified, Richard's cool demeanor began to fray, and Monroe knew she was getting closer to the truth. On June 22, 2015, a new lead emerged when a neighbor came forward with crucial information. She reported seeing Richard's car parked near the Carter residence on the night of the murder and hearing raised voices coming from inside the house. This witness testimony, combined with the other evidence, was enough for Monroe to confront Richard with the harsh reality. His lies were catching up with him. Monroe had Richard brought back in for another round of questioning. This time, she held nothing back. She laid out the timeline, the witness accounts, and the forensic evidence in meticulous detail. Richard sat across from her, visibly sweating, his confidence eroding with each new piece of evidence presented. Monroe's tone was sharp and unrelenting. "You were there, Richard. You were angry and you couldn't take no for an answer. What happened next?" Monroe's voice was calm, but there was an edge of impatience, pushing Richard toward the inevitable admission. Richard hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. Finally, he broke. In a voice trembling with guilt, Richard confessed. He admitted that he had gone to Stephanie's house that night to try to convince her to continue their affair. The argument had started in the kitchen, with Stephanie adamant about ending things for good. She accused Richard of being controlling and manipulative, and she demanded he leave. Richard's anger boiled over. He described how he had grabbed Stephanie's arm in a moment of fury and Stephanie pushed him away, and in a blind rage, Richard grabbed a heavy glass vase from the kitchen counter and swung it at her. The blow struck Stephanie on the side of her head, sending her crashing to the floor. Richard stood over her, horrified by what he had done, but instead of helping, he panicked and fled, leaving Stephanie to bleed out on the cold kitchen tiles. Monroe listened as Richard's confession unfolded, a mix of remorse and self-justification pouring out of him. Richard claimed it had been an accident, a momentary lapse in control, but Monroe knew that the evidence told a different story. Richard had acted out of jealousy and possessiveness, unable to handle the thought of losing his hold over Stephanie. With Richard's confession secured, Monroe wasted no time in solidifying the case against him. She gathered the final pieces of evidence, ensuring that there would be no room for doubt when the case went to trial. Richard was formally charged with second-degree murder, and the news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The scandal of Stephanie's affair, coupled with the brutal nature of her death, became the talk of Charlotte. As the trial approached, Richard's defense team attempted to paint him as a man who had been pushed to the brink by an emotional affair. They argued that Stephanie's rejection had driven him to a moment of madness, a crime of passion rather than premeditation. However, the prosecution countered with a detailed account of Richard's manipulative behavior, portraying him as a man who saw Stephanie as a possession rather than a partner. The trial was a media frenzy, with every new detail of the affair and murder splashed across headlines. Witnesses, including the neighbor who had heard the argument and seen Richard's car, testified about the volatile nature of Stephanie and Richard's relationship. The forensic evidence, Richard's inconsistent alibis, and his ultimate confession painted a damning picture. Stephanie's husband Daniel took the stand, recounting the heartbreak of finding his wife's lifeless body. He spoke of his shock at discovering the affair and the overwhelming sense of betrayal he felt, not just by Richard, but by the wife he thought he knew. His testimony was raw and emotional, underscoring the devastating impact of Richard's actions. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before reaching a verdict. Richard Alden was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he cast one last glance at the courtroom, a look of regret that came far too late. For Daniel Carter, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not peace. He sold the house where the tragedy occurred, unable to bear the memories that haunted its walls. He moved away from Charlotte, seeking a fresh start far from the shadow of his wife's death. The story of Stephanie Carter's affair and murder became a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. In the end, what had started as a secret romance turned into a deadly obsession, leaving a trail of heartbreak and loss that would never be forgotten. The aftermath of Stephanie Carter's murder left scars that went far beyond the courtroom. For those closest to her, the tragedy served as a grim reminder of how quickly lives could unravel when secrets fester beneath the surface. Richard Alden's imprisonment was a stark warning about the consequences of losing control, but for the families involved, there was no true sense of victory, only loss. Daniel Carter tried to rebuild his life, but the wounds ran deep. He found solace in his work and therapy, but the memories of Stephanie haunted him. Despite the betrayal, he mourned the woman he had loved, the life they had built together, and the future they would never have. Richard, now confined to a cell, had ample time to reflect on the choices that led him to this point. He remained bitter and unrepentant, blaming Stephanie and his circumstances rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. The man who once had everything, success, power, and the allure of forbidden love, was now reduced to a tragic figure, undone by his own desires. The community, too, struggled to move on. Stephanie's death and the scandal of her affair became a lingering ghost in the neighborhood, a story whispered in hushed tones whenever new rumors surfaced. It served as a stark example of how easily the veneer of perfection could crack, revealing the darkness hidden within. In the end, the tale of Stephanie Carter and Richard Alden was not just about a murder. It was about the fragile nature of human relationships and the catastrophic consequences when passion and betrayal collide.